Trench warfare came to life in World War One. They took different forms and had a wide range of differences depending on the sector. Trenches had many uses that benefited the armies in the First World War, but they also had advantages. They provided protection for the soldiers but also trapped them in a tight space. They also came with many diseases. People often question why trenches. The Germans developed trench warfare as a result of the failure of the Schlieffen Plan, which was to fight a war on both sides of the country. After their invasion on France failed, they needed the Russian army on the Eastern Front. They developed trenches to keep the Russians from being able to invade quickly. They also provided German soldiers with protection the opposing forces would try to invade. Parallel rows of trenches late 1914 and early 1915. On the Western Front, trenches soon ran from the Belgian border to the Swiss border and became home to millions of soldiers.
Trench warfare isn't very much like the modern fighting techniques we see today. Trench warfare is an older school fighting method, but has recently been used in the Iraq-Iran war, although it's very uncommon. Fighting techniques we see today are in urban areas and not trenches. When trenches don't have to be dug, it gives a more mobile sense to the troops, which is one of the main reasons trenches are still around. Troops need to be mobile, and they can't be mobile if they have to stop and dig trenches. Modern fighting techniques are normally from building.
The daily routines for soldiers in the trenches were that you had to start by a morning stand-to. A stand-to is where both sides would stand on the trench, his rifle loaded and bayonet fixed. They would do these both at dawn and dusk, because there was a theory that most enemies either before dawn or shortly after dusk. They did it at these times because the darkness hit them. They would then end the tension with a machine. After the stand, the men were then offered rum before the cleaning of their rifle equipment. After cleaning the equipment, breakfast was then served. When breakfast was over, they would be inspected by either the company or platoon commander. After their inspection was over, they would be assigned daily chores for each man unless you were excused duty for a variety of reasons. When men were done with their assigned tasks, they would then be able to do more personal things such as reading or writing of letters. Other meals were then prepared and sleep was snatched up as much as possible. With dusk approaching, they would then perform their stand-to just like in the morning. As you know, while you're fighting in a war, there are many problems that occur throughout. During World War I, there are several problems faced. One of the problems that were faced was that there were daily deaths in the trenches. The soldiers that were fighting in the trenches for the first time were the ones that often died. The next problem that was faced was rats. There were millions of rats that infested their trenches. There were brown and black rats. The brown ones were feared the most by soldiers. They feed off human remains and could grow to the size of a cat. These rats were not only source of infection. There was also frogs, lice, and something much worse. Lice was a never-ending problem. Lice bred in seams of soldiers' clothing. The men washed their clothes often, but the eggs would remain in the seams and hatch once they would start to fight and get warm again. There was also a disease called trench fever that started to take over. When the soldiers would get this, they would be in severe pain, and on top of that, they would have a high fever. This took weeks or months to recover from. Another form of disease that was often caught was called trench foot. Trench foot was a fungal infection on the foot caused by the cold, wet, and unsanitary conditions. This was eventually improved as the war continued. The last problem that was faced was the smell. The smells were either dead carcasses or from the disinfecting chemicals that they used in the trenches.
Trench warfare came to be during World War I. All trenches have different sizes and shapes, which makes them very unique. Trenches help soldiers have cover in open areas, but trenches also have bad things about them. They kept the soldiers in tight spaces with a lot of disease. Trenches were a huge invention that changed